I discovered this by accident, or at least that's what it seemed like at first. It was an ordinary afternoon. Nothing unusual was happening. I wasn't looking for a solution, wasn't in the middle of deep research, wasn't trying to solve anything in particular. I was just living that automatic routine most of us follow without questioning, when I stumbled across something that seemed far too simple to matter. So simple, so common, so inexpensive, that I almost ignored it entirely. My first reaction was dismissal. This can't make a real difference. If it were this simple, everyone would already know about it. Everyone would already be doing it. But there was a question that wouldn't leave my head. An uncomfortable, persistent question that kept coming back every time I tried to push it away. Why, even with basic things, did my mind seem to be failing? I'm not talking about major failures, not forgetting where I parked the car in an enormous mall after 2 hours of shopping, not failing to remember the name of someone I briefly met 3 years ago. I'm talking about small failures, daily ones, the kind that shouldn't be happening. Names of people I knew well, people I interacted with, regularly vanishing at the exact moment I needed them. Simple appointments I had written down, confirmed, and still forgotten. Tasks that had been mentioned less than an hour ago disappearing completely, as if they had never existed. At first, the defense mechanism worked fine. It's distraction, it's fatigued, it's the number of things happening simultaneously. It's normal. Everyone goes through this, and it works for a while, that reassuring narrative. It has a certain superficial rationality. After all, modern life is genuinely hectic, genuinely overloaded, genuinely full of simultaneous demands competing for attention. But over time, that explanation became increasingly difficult to sustain, because the failures kept coming, and they kept coming with a frequency that didn't match the "it's just distraction" story. You lose objects with a regularity that starts to seem impossible. The keys, the glasses, the phone that was in your hand 30 seconds ago, you put them somewhere, and that somewhere simply doesn't register. As if the brain decided, at that specific moment, not to record that information. You interrupt your own reasoning mid-sentence, so you're explaining something you know well, something you've explained dozens of times, and suddenly the thread vanishes. You feel the thought dissolve before reaching the end, and you have to improvise a conclusion that wasn't what you meant to say. You feel that sudden blankness that stops you cold in the middle of a conversation. The other person is waiting. You know the information is somewhere. You can almost touch it, but it doesn't come. And every second that passes without it coming increases the pressure, which increases the block, which makes it even harder to retrieve what you were trying to access. And the hardest part isn't the forgetting itself. It's what it causes inside, the insecurity. That's the consequence nobody talks about openly, but that anyone who has lived through this recognizes immediately. It's not just frustration with memory, it's a gradual shift in how you relate to your own mind. A silent erosion of the confidence you had in yourself as someone who thinks clearly, communicates well, is mentally present and reliable. You start hesitating before speaking because you're not sure you'll be able to finish the reasoning without locking up. You start avoiding certain situations, meetings where you'll need to remember details, conversations that will require you to access specific information, contexts where a memory failure will be visible and embarrassing. You start apologizing preemptively. Sorry, my memory has been terrible lately. As if laying the groundwork for the next failure you know is coming. And every time you do that, every time you dodge, every time you hesitate, every time you apologize, you're reinforcing an internal narrative about yourself that becomes increasingly difficult to undo. A narrative that says, My mind is not reliable. That was the point where I decided I wasn't going to accept that narrative anymore. And that was when I started looking at all of this in a completely different way. Not as random failures, not as symptoms of some inevitable decline, but as signals. Signals of something specific that was directly interfering with the way my brain was functioning. Not something mysterious, not something outside my control, not something I simply had to accept. Something concrete, identifiable, and most importantly, addressable. And the more I investigated, the clearer a pattern became. These memory blocks don't come out of nowhere. They are built, slowly, consistently, over days and weeks, through a set of conditions that modern life creates almost automatically for most people. Constant mental overload, a permanent state of processing where the brain never receives a genuine rest to organize what it has received. Excessive digital stimulation that keeps the nervous system in continuous alert. Lack of moments of genuine cognitive silence, not acoustic silence, but mental silence, where the brain isn't processing new inputs but consolidating previous ones. Deep sleep deprivation that prevents the nightly neurological cleaning process. Low-grade inflammation that compromises communication between neurons. And when all of this combines, when the environment you've created for your brain is consistently hostile to its optimal functioning, the result is predictable. Clarity disappears. Focus fluctuates. Memory fails. And the cycle self-perpetuates. Failures generate anxiety. Anxiety generates more cognitive overload. Cognitive overload generates more failures. And it's exactly this cycle and how to break it with a simple, accessible adjustment that we detail in the guide available at the first link in the description. Click now and access it. But in the middle of this investigation, I found something that seemed too simple to make a difference. And I have to be honest, my initial reaction was skepticism. Because when you're looking for a solution to something that seems large and complex, you naturally expect the answer to be equally large and complex. A sophisticated intervention, an elaborate protocol, something that requires effort, proportional to the problem. What I found was none of that. It was small, inexpensive, practically within reach of any person. Something that costs less than $3 to implement. But the science behind it was solid. And when I understood the mechanism, when I grasped why it worked at the neurobiological level, the skepticism disappeared. Because it made sense. Perfect sense. The central mechanism is this. The modern brain is operating in a state of chronic stimulation that never existed. For most of human history, think about the contrast. For hundreds of thousands of years, the human brain evolved in an environment of relatively scarce and predictable stimuli. There were periods of intense activity, hunting, gathering, social interactions, followed by genuinely long periods of low stimulation. Moments where the brain simply rested, where it could process in peace, organize what it had received, consolidate memories, make connections between pieces of information. Today, that rhythm has been completely destroyed. We wake up to notifications. We consume content while having coffee. We check messages in the bathroom. We work with multiple tabs open, each competing for attention. We eat lunch staring at a screen. We come home still processing work. We relax with series and infinite feeds. We sleep when we manage to, with the brain still in accelerated processing mode. The result is a nervous system that never slows down. And a nervous system that never slows down is a nervous system that never adequately consolidates, because memory consolidation, the process by which information moves from working memory to long-term memory, requires low stimulation states. It requires the brain to enter modes of internal processing where it organizes, categorizes, connects, and files what it has received. When that space never exists, consolidation is compromised. Information arrives, gets processed superficially, and then dissipates because it never received the environment necessary to become a lasting memory. And here is the simple adjustment I found. Intentionally creating those spaces of low stimulation in a regular, consistent way. Not elaborate meditation, not a spiritual retreat, not hours of isolation. Small daily windows of genuine cognitive silence. And the most accessible, most affordable, most effective way to create those windows, the one that costs less than $3, involves an element that most people dismiss entirely as outdated, unnecessary, or irrelevant to cognitive health. But the data says otherwise. Neuroscience studies consistently show that continuous exposure to high-speed digital stimuli, especially the kind of content we're drowning in today, reduces the capacity for sustained attention, compromises memory consolidation, and increases cortisol levels, the stress hormone. On the other hand, regular periods of low-intensity stimulation where the nervous system operates in parasympathetic mode, where the brain isn't processing new inputs but organizing existing ones, produce measurable effects on cognitive function, improved sleep quality, reduction of low-grade neural inflammation, increased BDNF production, greater efficiency in memory consolidation, reduction of accumulated cognitive load that blocks clear thinking. And the most interesting part, these effects start appearing quickly, not in months, in days, because the brain is highly responsive. When you remove a chronic source of overload, even partially, even for short periods, it starts reorganizing almost immediately. The first signs are subtle. The mental fog isn't as heavy in the morning. The slowness that used to dominate the first hours of the day starts to ease. You feel slightly less scattered, slightly less at the mercy of your own thoughts. Then, in the first week, something more specific starts to emerge. You catch yourself remembering things without strain, names that used to take time to come arrive more easily. Details from recent conversations are more accessible. Tasks you would normally have had to write down to remember are simply there when you need them. And by the start of the second week, the change is consistent enough that you can no longer attribute it to coincidence. Not because something magical happened, but because you created the conditions for the brain to do what it was always capable of doing when it has the right environment. But there's an aspect of this change that goes beyond memory. And this is the aspect that surprised me most. When you start reducing chronic overload, when you create regular spaces of cognitive silence, when the brain begins operating more efficiently, you don't just remember better, you think better. The quality of reasoning improves, not just the speed, but the depth, the capacity to hold multiple variables in mind simultaneously. The ability to make connections between pieces of information that previously seemed disconnected. Access to insights that were previously blocked by the constant fog. And this translates into communication. You start expressing yourself with more clarity. Words come more naturally. You can articulate complex ideas without losing the thread. You maintain coherence in long conversations without drifting. And with that comes something that goes far beyond cognition. Confidence. That confidence you had been losing gradually with each forgetting, each lockup, each embarrassing blank moment, starts coming back. Not as a sudden leap, but as a consistent process. You stop hesitating before speaking. Stop avoiding situations that previously seemed cognitively risky. Stop apologizing preemptively. You start trusting your own mind again. And that is perhaps the most valuable result of all. If you're tired of forgetting simple things, locking up mid-sentence, living with the feeling that your mind is operating below what it should, the guide we left in the first link of the description shows exactly how to apply this adjustment in your daily life. It's practical, accessible, and starts making a difference in days, not months. Click now. And here's what I want you to understand about all of this. Your brain isn't failing. It is overloaded. There is an enormous difference between those two statements. One speaks to capacity, something you have or don't have, that works or doesn't work, that can or cannot be improved. The other speaks to condition, a temporary state, created by specific circumstances that can be changed when those circumstances change. Real cognitive decline, the kind associated with neurodegenerative conditions, is relatively rare and has very specific characteristics. What most people experience as bad memory or poor focus is fundamentally different. It is the result of a highly capable brain operating under conditions that are systematically hostile to its optimal functioning. Stimulus overload, consolidation, deprivation, low grade, chronic inflammation, deep sleep deprivation, sustained stress, absence of cognitive silence. Remove those factors even partially, even gradually, and the system responds. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because you stopped doing something that was actively preventing the brain from functioning the way it is capable of functioning. Today, I no longer see those early signals the same way. Not as evidence that something is irreparably wrong, not as the beginning of an inevitable decline, but as feedback, as the system telling me, the conditions aren't right, adjust. And when you learn to interpret these signals that way, as information, not as a verdict, you gain something that goes far beyond improved memory. You gain control over clarity, over focus, over confidence, over the way you show up in your own life. And perhaps most importantly, you realize there is still time, that the brain responds, that change is possible, not in some distant future after months of heroic effort, but now, with simple, accessible adjustments that any person can begin today. If you're frustrated with constant forgetting, with the feeling of a foggy mind, with a lack of focus that seems to have no explanation, the method we left in the pinned comment and in the first link of the description was developed exactly for this. It's evidence-based, practical, and shows you step by step how to remove the blocks that are preventing your mind from operating at its best level. Don't put it off. Click now. If this made sense to you, if at any point while watching you thought, that's exactly how I feel, then subscribe to the channel, because in the upcoming videos I'll keep showing you, in a simple, practical way based on what actually works, how to unblock, strengthen, and protect your mind. No impossible formulas, no radical changes nobody can sustain, no empty promises. Only what works, explained in a way that anyone can understand and apply. Starting today, because your mind is capable of far more than what you're seeing right now. And the path to get there starts exactly here.